The man running the late-night board at WCHB had a habit of leaving the television on low while he worked the overnight shift. Not for company, just something to fill the room between call-ins and dead air. He had done it for years. Nobody had ever said anything about it. That Thursday in late 1971, he turned up the volume when he saw Frank Sinatra walk out onto the Tonight Show stage. Johnny Carson was already leaning back in his chair, the way he always did. Comfortable, a half smile ready before the guest had even sat down. The kind of man who made every room feel like it had been built for this exact conversation. The audience applause faded slowly. Sinatra crossed his legs, adjusted his jacket cuff, and reached for the glass on Carson's desk before he had even finished settling in. Easy, unhurried. The posture of a man who has never once walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there. He didn't scan the audience, didn't look for approval. He already knew what he thought about everything. The radio man set his coffee down on the console. He had been playing What's Going On that station since May. Before most of the country caught up to it, he had taken calls from listeners at 2 in the morning who said they had to pull over because they couldn't drive and cry at the same time. A woman once called to tell him she had played it for her son the night before he deployed. He never forgot that call. He had watched the album numbers come in each week, watched the record climb places it wasn't supposed to reach. He knew what it was, and he knew what it had cost to exist. Not just the labor of making it, but the specific, exhausting fight of making it when every person who held any power over Marvin Gaye's life had looked him in the eye and said no. Carson brought up soul music, carefully the way white television in 1971 handled the subject, a kind of thoughtful distance, like asking someone about a country you've read about but don't intend to visit yourself. Sinatra smiled, slow, easy. He talked about the new wave of records coming out of Detroit, about how music had gotten too serious for its own good, too occupied with causes and politics, and making people feel guilty for wanting to be entertained. A great song, he said, gives people somewhere to go, not somewhere to think. The whole point of music is that it takes the weight off, even for 3 minutes. And then, still relaxed, still completely at home, he said that What's Going On sounded like it was written by a man who couldn't decide if he wanted to make a record or deliver a sermon to people who hadn't asked for one. The audience laughed. Carson laughed. Sinatra picked up his glass. At WCHB, the radio man sat very still for a moment. Then he reached over and turned the television off. Not in anger. He didn't slam anything, didn't say a word. He just turned it off and sat in the quiet, the way you do when something gets said that you know you're going to carry for a long time. The equipment around him hummed the way it always did. The room looked exactly the same, but something in it had changed, or maybe something in him had. Marvin Gaye heard about it 2 days later. Not from a newspaper, not from anyone at Motown. A session musician told him almost apologetically at the end of an afternoon in the studio. The kind of thing someone brings up because they feel like you should know, even if they're not sure you'll want to hear it. Marvin was sitting on the edge of the piano bench, not playing, just sitting with his hands resting on his knees. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. When the musician finished, Marvin was quiet for a few seconds. Then he nodded once and asked if anyone wanted coffee. That was it. No raised voice, no speech forming behind his eyes. Just the nod, and then something quieter that people who knew him recognized immediately. A stillness that meant something had landed, and that he was deciding what to do with it. It was not the stillness of someone who didn't care. It was the stillness of someone who cared deeply and knew the difference between reacting and responding. He had been through this kind of thing before. When Berry Gordy heard What's Going On for the first time, he called it the worst record he had ever heard in his life. Not the worst thing Marvin had made, the worst record, full stop. Gordy ran the numbers the way he always did. Vietnam, poverty, police violence, a jazz arrangement, a song that asked questions instead of selling answers. And he was certain it would not move. Certain it would embarrass the label and cost him money he didn't want to lose. He sat across from Marvin and said no, without much deliberation. Marvin had received it the same way. Quiet. He went home and didn't record for weeks. He didn't take many calls. He sat with what he knew the way you sit with something that is true, even when every person around you is telling you it isn't. He didn't draft a statement. He didn't call journalists. He just waited, held on to what he had made, and refused to let other people's certainty become his own. When Gordy finally agreed to release the record, partly because Marvin had made clear, without drama, that he would not step into a studio again until it was out. What's Going On sold 200,000 copies in its first week. Motown's switchboard ran out of capacity from radio stations calling to request more copies. Gordy reportedly stood in his office, reading the sales report in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. Rolling Stone would eventually call it the greatest record ever made. The same record he had refused to release. The same song he had called the worst he had ever heard. Gordy never quite apologized. Marvin didn't seem to need one. But Sinatra on Carson was something different. Gordy's rejection had been internal. A room, a meeting, a private argument between a label and the man it thought it owned. What happened on The Tonight Show went into living rooms across the country. It went to the man at WCHB and to every person who had ever pulled over on the shoulder of the road with that record playing. It was public, and it was comfortable, and the comfort was the part that stayed. The absolute ease of a man who had no doubt that his version of music, his era, his rules were still the ones that applied to everyone else. Marvin let it sit for a few days. Then he went to the studio. The engineer working that night said later that Marvin came in around 9, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he came alone and didn't want much conversation before starting. He sat at the piano for nearly an hour without committing to anything, playing pieces of things, stopping mid-phrase, sitting in silence, starting somewhere else entirely. The engineer stayed out of it. Working with Marvin long enough, you understood that the silence was not absence. It was where the real decisions were being made. You didn't interrupt it. You kept the level set, kept the tape rolling, and let him find what he was looking for. At some point, Marvin began singing something that wasn't in any session plan. It wasn't a protest song, not a rebuttal or a counter-argument. It was warm and physical and so certain of itself that the engineer said the feeling in the room actually shifted. Like a window had been opened somewhere, or like something that had been pressing down had been quietly set aside. What grew out of those sessions, across the weeks that followed, became "Let's Get It On." If Sinatra's argument was that great music gives people somewhere to escape rather than somewhere to think, Marvin's answer was not delivered in that language at all. It was a record so completely human, so unguarded, so uninterested in defending its right to exist, that the whole debate dissolved around it. You couldn't listen to it and think about winning or losing anything. You just listened. He never mentioned Sinatra publicly, not in any interview, not in any conversation anyone preserved, not once in the years that followed, not even when journalists handed him obvious openings. Some things don't require a response in the language they were delivered. Some things just get answered by what you make next. And some things get answered so completely that the original question stops mattering to anyone. But those who were close to Marvin during those weeks described something specific in how he moved through the sessions. Not anger, not the satisfaction of correcting someone. Something closer to the feeling that arrives when a person finally stops trying to explain himself to people who have already made up their minds and goes back to doing what he was going to do regardless. A kind of freedom that only becomes available once you stop asking for permission. The Tonight Show kept going. Carson kept his chair for 20 more years. Sinatra kept performing, kept releasing records, kept being exactly who he was. A man of enormous talent and enormous certainty that had traveled together for so long, they had become impossible to separate from each other. What's Going On kept climbing. Critics who had been careful, who had hedged their praise with qualifications and caveats and careful distance, eventually ran out of ways to hedge. And Let's Get It On, when it arrived the following year, went to #1 and stayed, played at weddings and films through apartment walls at 3 in the morning, the way certain music gets into the structure of things and doesn't come back out. The radio man at WCHB eventually got promoted to a larger station in Chicago, then left radio entirely after 20 years. He kept a cassette copy of the first time he broadcast What's Going On. Not the polished album version, just a rough recording from before the song had a name that most people recognized. He kept it in a kitchen drawer for 30 years. He wasn't sure he could explain why. Maybe because some things need a witness. Some things happen in control rooms and on late-night stages and in quiet studios at 9 in the evening. And if nobody holds on to the record, It's as if the whole thing never occurred at all. Sinatra's comment on Carson that night was never preserved in any official transcript. Nobody wrote down the exact words. What exists is the memory of people who were watching and the music that came afterward, and the distance between those two things. The distance between a man who believed he was dismissing something and what that something turned out to be. Marvin never wanted to win an argument. He wasn't built for that kind of victory, the kind that requires someone else to stand in the loss. What he had always wanted, from the first time he stood close enough to a microphone to feel the vibration come back through the floor, was to be heard. Not explained, not defended, just heard. He was. The man sitting at that piano bench in late 1971, building something out of silence and wait and a refusal to answer in anyone else's terms. He was already heard before the tape started rolling, before anyone outside that room knew the session had begun. Some nights in music are remembered because of what was said out loud, and some are remembered because of what was made in the hours after, built quietly, without announcement, by someone who decided one more time not to explain himself to anyone. That was the night that mattered, not the one on television. If Marvin's story moves something in you tonight, leave a comment. What does his music mean in your life? And a like is a small thing, but for a channel this size, it means more than you know.